Welcome to the next episode of Chris, Rod, Mac Show. Today we have Chris and Rod with us. Hi Chris, hi Rod.
Hello everyone.
Hi.
Where every single week we are going to spend some time talking about AI generated content today. And then we're going to talk a little bit about AI agents, a little bit around how we can get to AGI, artificial general intelligence, spend a little bit of time talking about hardware, as well as all the new investments that are going to all the larger AI companies, right? Trying to figure out who exactly are investing into what. And without further ado, let's dive straight in. So, first, Rod, we've been doing this, podcast for some time now. Indirectly, we're also trying to generate content as, I guess, a creator, if you will. And there has been a push within an industry to come up with some sort of coalition to label AI generated content versus non-AI generated content from a rights perspective. And there's a new article by Fortune that spent some time talking about LinkedIn trying to label, I would say, AI generated content. And obviously, we'll run into some troubles if people are not already adopting those standards per se. I just wanted to get a little bit of your thoughts, right, around number one. Is it important to label AI generated content? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. I don't know. Number two, what are your thoughts around how we could potentially implement some things like this? Because as you probably know, what is filling AI in this world is data. Does it matter if it's an AI generated content or not? So love to hear both your thoughts. Maybe I'll start with you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Max. It's a very important topic, and I think especially around the time of the election of the president of the United States and the fake news that are keep popping up. And maybe for the sake of the audience, let's talk a little bit about what does actually labeling mean. So actually, to simplify it, there are two ways of labeling. There's one way of labeling throughout metadata. And the way to imagine that one is basically when you take a picture, you have some geolocation actually tagged to this image that is not necessarily in your face on the image, but it is read and you can find it in your file. If a program wants to extract that geolocation data, that is possible. That's one way of labeling it. And then the second way of labeling is obviously the watermark, the very ugly one that you have on images, like, copyrighted by someone. So those are the two types of labeling. And so when we think about AI, we think about also labeling either as metadata. So a computer, another robot, or a software can actually understand that this content is generated by an AI, or it is very much like marked onto whatever the AI actually produced. And I remember we actually spoke about this topic earlier in the year when we spoke about China inventing this one pixel that actually is added to each image, each video that is generated by AI. And I think this is just maybe for the context, for the benefit of our audience. Now, to your question, Max, in my opinion, it is a good thing that we looked into it. However, I feel like, is it really adding anything? Because also I can use Photoshop and Photoshop a Trump on something else and kind of, put it out into the internet. And also without Gen AI or AI in general, we had that issue with fake news, right? So I'm not sure how much it will actually help with that.
Thank you so much for that, Chris, especially on the explanation. I think, to your point around metadata is that you're taking an iPhone photo and then you swipe up, they will tell you exactly where everything is if you don't turn off your geolocation, for example. I think, Rod, how about you? What are your thoughts around, I guess, this AI generated content? I think to Chris's point as well, I mean, if I were to, quote one thing that Steve Jobs said, right, the good artists copies, great artist steals. In a way, if the future is just gonna fight on data in order to build better application, it just feels like this is an inevitability. But Rod, what are your thoughts?
Well, Chris took the perspective from, let's say, the big events, elections, maybe like so large media and so on. I want to take the small perspective, so to say, where just this week came an article, a study from a company called Originality AI. They are focused on exactly AI detection, and they looked in LinkedIn data. So where they have detected that since the launch of ChatGPT, there has been an increase of up to 189% of AI posts on LinkedIn since ChatGPT launched. This was October 2022. So now we have 2 years since then. And they estimate that by now around 54% of all posts on LinkedIn are AI generated. And not only that, but also that since we started using ChatGPT, posts became much more verbose. They have pretty much doubled their size. They're twice as long as they used to be before ChatGPT. So the way that I see it is that now we are surrounded by AI content. Some of them maybe is relevant, insightful, and so on. Some of them is also lower quality. But I think it's also a little bit of, let's say, from an ethical perspective, that if we draw some parallels, for example, with influencers and so on, there was a time where people would promote products on social media, Instagram, YouTube, whatnot, and it was never clear if they were sponsored or not. Some people will say it, they will say this is a promotion, this was sponsored, but now it has become standard that when you create a post, it has a little button saying this has a promotion, this is sponsored, and then there is a tag. And this way, the reader, the viewer knows this is in sponsored posts. So I think something like that might be beneficial for us. So to have here, this was generated with AI, and then people can judge and decide. So do I maybe diminish the value of the post because it was AI generated, or I don't care?
I think that's a very, very good point. I think around the classification of whether or not using AI to generate the content, the question then becomes at what point do you think that is AI generated? So, for example, so Chris wrote we could type something and then an AI could just help us to fix it. It might have changed the prose of it. So is that AI generated or not? So we'll get into those technicality as we get along. But I do think your point makes sense, Rod, which is at least help the average social media user to identify that this content may have been generated with using some sort of AI technology. Cool. I think that is, to me is super interesting because as we progresses through the AI revolution, we're seeing more and more AI agents utilizing data that are publicly available as well as privately available in order to do a certain task. And I recently, I think Rod, you found this great report for Menlo VC, which is one of the oldest VC fund, if I'm not wrong, in the Valley, which they have come out and basically wrote a pretty long report on AI agents specifically, talking a little bit about how and where people are spending money, where which I would say enterprise department are spending most of their money around AI agents, and as we think about data and finding out use cases for AI agents, some of the key things that we're seeing, I guess, from a AI enterprise application perspective, is things like code copilots, support chatbots, anything to do with searching within your enterprise knowledge, right? You have a lot of hidden data as well as summarizing meetings. Those are some of the key things that are coming out at the moment. I guess then my question to both of you is, as we have progressed so far for a year, love to get both your thoughts around, some of the use cases that if you folks have seen in within your daily realm. And then I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about, I guess, the churn issue. So that one of the things that I guess, contrary to the report itself, is that we're seeing AI agents getting to, I guess, few million AR really quickly. But anecdotally, I'm also hearing that, because large enterprises are looking to build themselves, there are also going to be some churns for startups in this certain area. But love to hear both your thoughts around this as well. So maybe I'll start off with Rod this time.
So here about this report, what caught my eyes were that they were saying that the most common architectures for application development, one is what is called so retrieval augmented generation, RAG. This is a classic chat with your data type of application. So where I have some PDF and I can ask questions. But then the second most popular one was agents. And this is something that really surprised me because at the beginning of the year, when people were speculating what comes next, what is like the next big thing for AI related products, people were not mentioning agents. People were mentioning fine tuning models, meaning I take a large model from the internet, let's say like Llama from Meta, and then I apply some of my internal data and I make a smaller model that is more specific for my problem and my own data. But turns out that according to this report, this actually has not really caught up. I think it's because maybe it's challenging, it's complicated. But the other thing that I think is that all this topic of agents is really exciting for everyone. I also hear from everyone that I talk to. I'm trying to do like some courses around, and people are super excited about the idea. And I think that here, SaaS companies, they see it as the next big thing to sell, like marketing and positioning. The buyers, they see it as maybe the big promise for efficiency gains, maybe for overhead reduction. And then developers, they see this as just some cool topic to work on.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. I think that's interesting. Taking from the different personas that are likely going to deploy agent makes a lot of sense to me. I think sitting in an, or let's say enterprise world, I can definitely see that people are taking this as a giant efficiency gain, especially if you have a lot of operational steps required. How about yourself, Chris? What are some of the, I guess, observation or some of the takeaways from the report even?
Well, Rod, I'm surprised about your line of thoughts on, the next big thing is fine tuning. In my mind, I'm like, oh, we went from text to images, and then video is the next big thing. And I think just this week something got leaked out from Sora. But anyways, I think this aside, on the report itself, I think not so much new, in my opinion, on what we've been anyways talking about. I think one thing that caught my eye at least was their prediction. And one of the prediction they say is David beats Goliath and more incumbents to fall. And the assumption that they're making is that lots of incumbents or bigger companies, like they mentioned Salesforce, for example, UiPath, will be disrupted by smaller companies. And I think we have a bit of an antithesis here in our show, because we say, well, maybe it's the time for corporates to really rise, because we saw on one hand how much money has been deployed into internal enterprise kind of um, models. We spoke about Coca-Cola signing a 1.1 billion deal with Microsoft. We've talked about NVIDIA gearing up with, I believe it was Accenture, to really bring enterprise AI software into different companies. So I think this is something that I notice where we might have another view on it. And actually, the thesis being, as a startup, at least in Europe and in Asia, you probably don't get the funding to scale fast enough to not be disrupted next day by one of the more like tech titans, which I also would include OpenAI into it. To your second part of the question, Max, around use cases and other use cases we see, I honestly believe that we are not in the phase anymore of like trying to like find more use cases. Rather, I believe it's the time where we can get better in certain use cases. And I think AI agents really give us the capability and ability to become better. So the very dumb AI chatbot isn't so dumb anymore, but can actually do things like, for example, rebooking a flight, or even more complex things such as also handling the payment behind it. So I would say the challenge now is more to convince people that have tried certain use cases to convince them to try it again, but have a better experience. So I think this will really be the next year's theme if I had to make a bet for next year.
Chris, that report has something that actually reflects our own behavior. So, and maybe you are also like a witness of that, where it has the market share of the model providers, and it shows how OpenAI went from around 50% market share to about 34% this year. So a year-on-year reduction of 16%. But Anthropic, the company behind Claude, went from 12% to 24%. And we have the same situation here in our group, right? So here we used to be big fans, big users of ChatGPT, but more and more we find ourselves working with Claude.
That's interesting. I think one thing within the report that also caught my eye a little bit, which is a lot of incumbents are actually utilizing, I would say, third party solutions to help them solve problems, either vertical AIs or horizontal AIs, you name it. And there's been a flip as well, where a lot more incumbents are trying to build something in it themselves. And something that I realized, at least based on my current conversation, that the more I spend time looking into AI agents, the more I felt like, okay, if you think about an AI agent, what they are really is taking data, being able to understand the data, make certain decisions, and then take actions on behalf of you. The question is, yeah, do you have a differentiated data, or do you have a differentiated view on how to process those data? And then do you have a differentiated way of taking action on those data? For a large enterprise to actually adopt it, you have to think in their sense. And unfortunately, that means it's quite tailored to that large enterprise. Because even if you go to banks, they might be best practices on how to run compliance and AML, for example. It may not be 100% the same because the risk factor, the point in which someone make a decision, would be very different. Because someone would be happy to take risk accept because of other, I will call it factors that are in place. So I just find that I guess over time the question is what are the mode for someone that's developing an AI agent for a large enterprise if they were to sell into them. So that's something that I guess has been playing in my mind, especially reading all this different report. Rod, I see
And
you wanted to say something.
yes, yes, I had a question for both you, Chris and Max. So the report also had already this chart showing the dominant generative AI use cases, and the number one by far was code generation. And there is this quote by Sundar Pichai, the CEO of the company behind Google. And so he's quoted with over 25% of all new code at Google is now generated by AI. And I was wondering, what are you seeing at your company? So is it really that the case that uh, the most common use case at your company is how people are working with AI tools is to generate new code? Is it like developers using these tools for new code generation, or is something else?
My 2 cents to this is engineers, coders tend to be, let me find a diplomatic word, but I can't. So I will just say it, which is maybe hinging on the more lazy side. So if they can automate stuff and if they can find another way in a shortcut, they will do it. So I think that is already something where it brings coders and engineers more into an early adopter type of role. And so that is why I think we see the statistics the way we do, and we see that a lot of code is getting replaced. I also think that coding is, or code in general, is something that is very deterministic, right? It follows a certain logic. So it's very, I think, easy to pick up by AI to learn the patterns and so forth. So my answer to your question is I think it depends on who you talk to, right? Like if you look on the business side, I do believe the biggest use case so far deployed is a chatbot. And honestly speaking, at this point, it's not even really great, to be honest. And I think most people still prefer to speak to like a human being because they believe that a human can actually solve the problem better than maybe an AI at this point in time.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, right, some of the use cases that we're seeing, it's more of a bolt on rather than a breakthrough. So code generation is one of them. You could think of then anything else from generation from then on. What does it mean? It means that let's say marketing copies, if someone wants to come up with marketing copies at a very, very quickly, they could do that and then a human would then, do the rest of the, the final touches before you send it out. There's also like, research reports, for example, like if you go to a bank, etc., they produce a lot of, all this equity research report take up a lot of time. We're also seeing like use cases coming up from those kind of business lines, right? They will generate, I guess, the first one and write that report, and then a human will go in and try to fix that. And then even if you think about like an investment process, you have people writing investment memos, same thing. Someone is using AI to generate the first draft of it, and someone can go read it after and fix it all up. So I think we're seeing those like co-pilot like use cases. But what I'm trying to get to is, like for it to be truly disruptive, you almost always have to like, just take that decision of writing in certain ways and then push it out, really pass out the decision making, being able to make the decision at that point. So I don't know when will that happen. I would find that quite interesting. So it's that you're able to, I guess, identify all the right data points and then eventually make the right call. Doesn't matter if it's making a trade, doesn't matter if it's sending a certain message or making a certain deal, if you will. I think with that, on the AI agent side as well, I think there was a new report from, I would call it Deloitte as well, speaking a lot more about how I guess AI agent for 2025 is gonna be taking off more. I think in general, I guess that is the case. I mean, it depends on which organization you speak to. We're seeing a lot more, I guess, AI infrastructure investment in this space. They talk a little bit about, I guess, around energy consumption and ethical security concerns. So I just wanted to get, I guess, both your thoughts around this, right? As AI agents progresses, what are some of the specific, I would say, challenges that you guys are seeing, or do you guys foresee, I suppose, based on what we just discussed earlier, at least for next year?
Max, don't you think we spoke about it quite extensively? We obviously speak about energy consumption and that only going up. I think also there's a bit of a limitation in data. I believe some of these are the challenges going forward, security and compliance issues. Do you see anything new added to that list because of AI agents in particular?
Yeah, so personally, some of the things that I've been thinking about, it's around, I guess, if you were to build AI agents, there's a lot like performance thing that we need to think about, right? Not just energy consumption. When I say performance, as in the performance of the output. So like that's one thing that I fear if you don't get right, you might affect the overall, I guess, adoption of it over time. Because if you look at the report where we talk about Menlo, right, number one thing that they care about is the quick ROI. And if we know anything, nothing comes quick. So it's just something that I've been thinking about. It's like, okay, if you want it quick, like, is it delivering enough value in the long term? It's a short term, long term thinking that I have in my head.
No, what I want to add is like possible things that we will see changing is, for example, we had in a previous episode the discussion of dating for agents and so on. And let's say this is on a consumer level, but what must happen on an enterprise level will be a massive transformation on access, the different services that so far are not say like, let's call it like agent friendly. And what does that mean? So just this month, Stripe, the payment company, made it possible that when you're interacting with their interface with their API, you can now enable these such that an agent service, an agentic service, can make payments on your behalf. And we have to think also all these banking APIs, all these internal processes and so on, that are not really made for any type of agentic workflows or processes. And I see that one of the big IT transformation that will happen likely next year will be adjusting many enterprise services and processes to make them more agent friendly.
That's a good point. I think um, we're seeing some of that already, actually. People are routing around their processes trying to make it work. I think the other thing that comes to mind is that, we're increasingly dependent on a few large language models. I'm actually quite happy that, you're seeing more LLMs to try and compete, to your point, Rod, around Claude and Anthropic, and then we're even going to get into XAI, etc. What I guess that kind of just segue to the next thing, or the key point on how do we get to AGI, written by Li Kai-fu. For those who don't know, Li Kai-fu is it's I would say quite a famed researcher that talk a little bit about that. I think he worked a lot on Microsoft and also Google, especially on AI research. I think one of the main thing that I remember from him was around how language is inherently biased. It's more male dominated than female dominated. He published like a report on that. That's why I always have like interesting, I guess, I would say references from him. One of the key points that he mentioned around his latest Wired article is how do we get to AGI? Is that you would deploy, I would say, lighter and smaller models rather than large language models, right? You always deploy something smaller on top of it. I guess love to get, I guess, both your thoughts around, I guess, his prediction around this, right? I'm seeing some of that, right? Everything from being able to identify the right connections for the right sort of words. It's trying to get to that, right? Building smaller models instead of getting things too large. And then my sense is for us to even think about AGI, the hardware will have to become way more and also way more, what you call it, tailored to the specific things that we're talking about, which means you have to be very, very integrated. don't know if the current, I guess, NVIDIA stack makes sense. But I mean, given Rod, you've been spending time with AI for a long, long time. Now we're adding a G to it. What are your thoughts?
I was thinking now that you mentioned Li Kai-fu, always I associate him with, so he had this book back in 2018. So by now it's like ancient, pretty much. It's called AI Superpowers. And he was maybe one of the first to try to bring together the idea of politics, geopolitics, and just AI and patterns that we're seeing now and that we have discussed many times on our show on how we're seeing Chinese related technologies that are very specific for China and they work really well there. And we have never heard about them here, and how we're creating islands that are separated so from each other in technology wise. So for anyone who has never heard of him or read about him, maybe this book is a good reference because it feels it was a little bit maybe prophetic in how things will develop. But what you're saying, Max, so regarding of how do we get to AGI or just like some advanced ways of AI, this is something that so one can pretty much do a full PhDs or spend their life trying to like, figure it out. But definitely one way is by not doing what we're doing now. I would say that maybe what we're doing now, technology wise, we're hitting limits. We're seeing they were having reports, for example, that OpenAI doesn't really know what to do next. And rather, for example, instead of trying to launch new models, new technologies, they're focusing more on, for example, how they can monetize all this agent related technology, how they can offer maybe like other services adjacent to what they're doing in terms, for example, allowing you to do e-commerce from ChatGPT, allowing you to book flights from ChatGPT and so on. So they're trying to offer new things instead of thinking how I can improve my model. And likely this is because just we're hitting limits.
Yeah, I mean, the premise that everything gets smaller is something we've seen in other fields of, let's say, computerism, IT as well, right? I mean, at the end of the day, software is also so much dominated by the limitation of hardware. And we have seen that hardware also has become much more efficient. I mean, obviously, semicon in general, following Moore's law. And I remember also, like, just 20 years ago, whatnot, our laptops would look completely different. We wouldn't even have laptops. We would actually have like a desktop, and it would be like a chunky little box sitting somewhere in our, I guess, kids' rooms at the time, no?
Yeah.
And this has become smaller and smaller, and it goes for every hardware, right? Like also our phones have become much more leaner, more efficient, given the limitation of space that the device also occupies. So I think this is a very normal development when it comes to AI, and AI obviously also runs on a hardware that becomes more efficient. And also we have seen how also OpenAI has come up with like leaner models or more verticalized models just to like simply help to save on cost, save on compute energy. And I think that's just a trend that I see also coming along in the next 1, 2, 3 years.
Yeah, I think while both of you were talking about that, I was trying to think about from an AGI perspective or smaller model perspective, and also I think to your point, Rod, which is we're hitting the ceiling when it comes to the model itself. Maybe it's time to break apart that model to smaller stuff. It's a little bit like how you have monolithic software, and eventually you get to all these microservices, which funds those stuff. I think one thing that came to mind specifically, it's around, quantum algorithm that basically help you to solve certain problems a lot quicker instead of brute force calculation from A to Z. They would just, try to randomly sample which are the most likely outcome for calculation, and then eventually get to that at a quicker level. I wonder, what we can do when it comes to all these large LLMs.
No, Max, I have a question for you. So, I mean, so this argument that you're making is pretty much the Web3 so argument of saying distributed, smaller, so it's better than centralized, and you are an expert in the field. So, do you think it will apply? Do you think it works? So, has it worked for Web3?
Well, first of all, I don't consider myself a I would say expert in Web3, but I have seen people try to crack this place, right? So there are two companies that come to mind, right? Number one is a company called Fetch AI, they've been around. They talk about agents for a long, long time in the Web3 space. So can you imagine the amount of complications that people, when they look at them, is like, what the hell are we talking about? You talk about an AI agent that act on behalf of you. Then you have to add some sort of like economics for those agents to be able to talk to each other. So there is something going on there around breaking down the smaller agents. And then on the model side, there is a company, I guess, called Jensen, I suppose. Basically, everyone trained different weights and biases and eventually coming together. It's almost like the federated learning way of getting things together. I don't know if it has worked super well, simply because I haven't looked into it. I think the other way that I would think about it is, just looking at Google, right? How has that gone well from a federated learning perspective, right? Have they been able to learn, I guess, the key knowledge and be able to feed it back to the mother brain? And I would tie that to, I would say, a podcast that I listened on Huberman Labs. He did a podcast specifically on learning protocols, like what is the best way to learn based on neuroscience. And one of the key things right at the end, he talked about learning. It's about not just about remembering, but it's also about forgetting. So you have to be able to automatically churn out some of the unnecessary stuff. So in order for you to become helpful, in order for you to actually function in life. If you remember every single little details in life, it's actually very hard to function as a normal human being because you're just catching up too many things. I suspect as we grow, as the model grow more, some of that it's going to come into play. And the reason why I use that as an example is because I felt like AI is just a giant brain to restore certain information to help you get to a certain output based on whatever input that you're giving it. Um, I know it's a little bit of a far-fetched idea, but yeah. So to your question is, I think the breakdown of those models, we haven't seen it work super well, but who knows? Maybe 2025 that will happen. Cool. I think to Chris's point, if we were to shift gears a little bit, is around hardware. So there are two news that I guess I wanted to point people's views to. Number one is Perplexity, the search I guess the search focus AI company is smiling getting into hardware. It's quite interesting, right? If you think about they're on the application layer, which is to utilize AI to search things, and they are trying to go the other way around, go back down to the hardware side. They obviously have their own models, etc. But love to get both your thoughts around this hardware thing. I think Chris, you provided some views that eventually we'll get to that. And then the second thing, I just really quickly and inject this. I guess Amazon did a quick investment, well, not a quick but large investment into Anthropic, a 4 billion investment into Anthropic. And I suspect a lot of all these model developers, if they have the capability, they might even go into the chipset. I think it's a little bit like how Apple was trying to go into the chip, right, from a normal computer perspective. So love to hear both your thoughts. Maybe Chris, given that you gave some views on hardware, maybe you can expand that on a little bit.
But Chris, I want to sort of frame it the following way. Will you say that, so just thinking, so you've been in your life a business consultant and so on. So how will you assess the situation that Perplexity, they have, according to LinkedIn, 284 employees. And now they're saying we want to get in the complete new different business line that has so many challenges. Doesn't it speaks poorly of the company that it feels like a massive defocus? They're trying to become the next Google, and now doesn't say, yeah, we want to do hardware devices. How would you assess that?
I've dabbled in hardware when we were doing software, and it is a very, very different type of game. I think finding the right partner to do it with is the right way to go, whether or not you hire them into the company or whether you partner with someone who is specialized in hardware. I think the main intention is obviously to try to reduce the reliance on NVIDIA chips, for example, or maybe even data centers, depending on the strategy. But at the same time, obviously, you could build this up to a new vertical and also provide other companies with your whatever chip. I think the challenge I also see is just simply the lead time that it takes to really come up with good hardware. And I think this we already can see in China, right? I mean, China is still catching up on sort of the US boom around AI and also the chips. And it's not so trivial to like come up with like good chips just overnight. So it does take quite a bit of fundamental basic R&D that needs to happen before it actually gets panned out. That's at least some high level thoughts that come to my mind.
I agree with you that I also feel that if someone is thinking, hey, I want to do hardware, the best approach is first, better don't do it because it's like always super complicated. But second, if you say, I still want to do it, then find a partner and so do it together. So where there are so many very efficient, very well integrated so companies doing high quality products, those things like Lenovo and so on, Dell, etc. So many hardware manufacturers. So why not partner with them and then try to come up with something? Because I just think in the case specifically for here Perplexity, they have so many things that they can do just on its current product, and the mission to replace Google is so large. And especially now there is a bit of a cultural shift where, especially during the US elections, they were so Google was being accused of being maybe like partial with the search results. But in general, the Google search results, they are not what they used to be. They're now so curated. That's why alternative search engines like DuckDuckGo and so on, they have a niche because people are looking for just pure search results. That if I'm looking for something, I will just get the most popular one and not some version of what Google thinks is the best for me. So just alone there is so much potential. And the fact that they're now maybe thinking on going this direction just shows that they are defocusing.
Yeah, I think to your point specifically around the way you would think about Perplexity's offering, it's like ChatGPT is coming for them, right? If ChatGPT were to come up with searches, or to a certain extent, Microsoft is really trying to do some of that with Bing, by putting ChatGPT into it, which means using AI as a search. And then Google is also trying to respond with their Gemini on the searches. Like on that front itself, there are going to be tons of competition. I haven't even gone into all the other search engines that are trying to, I guess, implement AI from that. Perhaps given that they have some lead start, it's probably better to focus. But I guess my sense is, maybe for them to get into hardware is to enhance that thing, right? They're trying to do, which is to beat searches. Maybe they realize that they can't really win if they don't own the entire stack because they're always at someone's mercy when it comes to processing and pushing those data out to get you to most accurate results. So yeah, I mean, it's almost like, we talk about application model and then the hardware. It's like where else can you optimize in order to get you to the output?
Next, maybe one thought on this. I mean, I think it would get really crazy if these companies would go into even more distant verticals such as solar power, energy. I
Meta
think
trying
that
to do
is
that.
something that I would very much think is in up the alley of Elon Musk. Right? So it's like, okay, how do I combine different things so that it makes sense and I can benefit over the whole system? But I think that would be very crazy if some of these players would actually think of going into that direction.
So exactly to your point, Chris, that's what Elon Musk is technically trying to do, if you think about it, right? Everything from rocket boosters, everything from AI, XAI development, and the buying of X specifically, right? Like X is a little bit like the town hall for the internet. If he's able to use those data to train the AI, and that's probably going to give him a little bit of a boost. And then from a model development perspective, that kind of just push it up. And then he, as a person who develops some of the technology, battery, and also the ability to spin up data centers within 16 days or something like that. Like those are all interesting point towards around vertical integration of this AI play. But I think we will only know at the end of it. I guess at this point, one thing I realize is that some of the traditional business sense that one needs to, I guess, preserve will probably not stand well because this is just moving too quickly, right? If there's a land to be grabbed, you will grab the land. Cool. Speaking of land to be grabbed, one thing that we basically found out on Sherwood News is around how all the larger AI companies are normally invested by larger corporates. I find that quite interesting, right? The mafias of all this are no longer just individuals, but also the larger corporates. So, based on Sherwood's analysis, they are just trying to identify who are the companies that backing all these AI startups. They have a nice little chart. Maybe we'll try to add the link into the show notes where they show Anthropic, Mistral, Perplexity, and OpenAI, and who are the key investors into all these different companies, right? So, for example, in the venture world, people always think about if you invest in one, you wouldn't go invest in another from a loyalty perspective. But sometimes, if you look at corporates, they really don't care. So, for example, SK Telecom invested in both Anthropic and Perplexity. Amazon did all three: OpenAI, Perplexity, and Anthropic, which we talk a little bit about. And then Databricks did both Mistral and Perplexity. I guess, based on this, I would say, web chat, I just wanted to get both your thoughts, Rob, Chris, in the final minutes of the show, just to get your thoughts around this. What are some of the things that you can think of, and why are larger corporates, playing their hands this way? And I must say, I'm also surprised that did not see Meta on it. So over to you, maybe Chris.
Good point, Max. I don't see Meta either. That's very interesting. Also, Elon Musk is somewhat missing on this picture, I would say. Yeah, you're talking about the entanglement, and yes, we certainly will link the image into our show notes. The thought that comes to my mind is it's almost like a zero sum game. You're sort of diversifying across a sector that you bet will win. That's how I would interpret it, and you just don't know who's going to win. So basically, you just put some chips into all of them and see where it goes, and one of them will be taking it all, and you will benefit from it. It also reminds me of another image that I've seen a couple of years ago, actually with the entire ride-hailing mafia. What do I mean by that? I think there were these five big ride-hailing companies: Uber, you had Lyft, you had Didi, you had Kareem, and maybe another one. And
Yep.
also, if you were to build the net of investors, it would also look very similarly. You would have all these cross uh, cross investments from an Uber into a Didi into an Uber, and all of that type of net. And I think again, the idea here is to diversify across a sector that is, you know, thought to be won or thought to win anyways, and will be here to stay. And this is probably similar to what we see here with the AI world.
Perfect. Final thoughts from you, Rod.
I just want to say that likely companies have learned from the first internet wave in the early 90s. Remember, there were so many e-commerce companies, there were so many other businesses that are no longer with us today. And most likely that will happen with AI. So it's unclear yet who are the winners, who will stay here for the long term. And it makes sense to spread out your bets, don't have all your eggs in one basket, and invest in as many companies as you can.
Perfect. Great. It's almost like we're building ETFs of all these companies. Some of them are public companies anyway. So you can build an ETF of all the public companies, and you're technically in the AI play. Great. With that, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for yet another episode. We are really excited to share all this news with you. If you really like what you're hearing now, definitely smash the like button and share it with your friends. And just a quick recap, today we spoke a little bit about AI-generated content, spent a little bit of time talking about Gen AI reports, also talk a little bit about how we would potentially get to AGI, hardware, and looking at the new mafias of AI. And we will share all the links in the show notes. And if you like what you're hearing, as I mentioned before, smash the like button and share it with your friends. We'll see you next week.